I'm Jess, and it's so great to be with you for a few moments today. Welcome to Kingston Standard Church, our online version. I'd love to invite you to connect with us online or in person. If you're in the Kingston area, come on out. We would love to see you. If you're limited to online connection though, not a problem. Just be sure to check out our website for at-home worship resources. But in the description box of this video, you're going to find the link to our website. As well, you can always follow us on YouTube and like us on Facebook, and be sure to subscribe to both so that you'll stay up to date on all the new content when it's posted. We have a variety of resources available to families and kids on both Facebook and YouTube, so if this is your first time joining us, or if you've been here before, we want to encourage you to go ahead and check that out, because our mission is to equip families for the conversations that they have together to learn and grow and follow Jesus. And if you want to touch base personally, then feel free to reach out. You can send us a message on Facebook, or you can use the address below. So let's dive in and see what we're going to learn about today.
At some point in our lives, everyone has compared themselves with someone. And sometimes that can be in a healthy way. If it helps us to understand our own personal limits or places where maybe we need help. One time in one of the places we lived, I was doing some work finishing a basement. And we had a neighbor who was a pro drywall installer and finisher. And so I had worked my way through putting up all the drywall, had done a couple of coats with the mud, and then I asked him to have a look and give me some advice. Before he ever looked at it, he showed up with his tools and he helped me to do the finish coat. And as I watched him, I realized his experience was astounding. He was an artist with the drywall mud. He did an absolutely amazing job preparing it for it to be painted, and it looked better than I ever possibly could have done with my limited experience at that point. He got us further faster than I could have ever moved in that period of time. And you know, when we understand our own limits and we can see where we need help, that can be healthy. But then on the other side, there's this grading we do sometimes with ourselves and with other people. It starts sometimes with our perceived successes and failures, and it can be launched from times that we spend on social media or our experiences, the ups and downs that are a part of our lives. We tend to create this scale that determines our value versus someone else's. And we can assign ourselves a grade in a very unhealthy way. And it often leads to maybe a freeze or even creating a very limiting life narrative, sometimes with statements like, well, you know, I'm just not that smart, or I'm not that skinny, or I'm not that big, or I'm not funny enough. Sometimes I'm just dumb. Sometimes I'm just stupid. People really don't like me. My opinion doesn't matter. Now, whether it's in marriage or work, whether it's in recreation or in family, any aspect of life that gets tainted with these kind of unhealthy comparisons and statements like this, they not only make us unhealthy, but they spread the toxin to others. There's a story of how circus-performing elephants are trained to stay where their handler puts them. Early on in the life of the elephant, they tend to shackle one leg with a chain that is then attached to a very large and powerful tree. Now the elephant resists the shackle and pulls on the chain, but eventually comes to accept that they can't get away. As a result, that same shackle sends the same message to the elephant no matter where they go, and so the chain can be detached and attached to a simple stake that the elephant could easily pull off and wander away to its freedom. They don't even realize that they're barely connected, but ultimately a step in the right direction that would pull out that stake would lead them to recaptured freedom. And one place where comparison can really wreak havoc in our lives, it keeps us shackled, so to speak, and limiting our freedom, in times when we're finding ways to seek purpose and meaning, and considering our connection with God. God looks to call us to love and to serve and to engage with Him. But oftentimes our experience, the kind of talk that we give ourselves in our minds, the comparison messages that we've been in the habit of listening to, they shackle us from stepping into full engagement with an extraordinary God, because they crowd out our ability to hear what He has to say. And God always works through ordinary people, like we're about to see in the book of Judges today. And it's a familiar story to some of you in Judges chapter 6 of the man named Gideon. Now, Gideon is kind of a poster child for creating excuses about feeling inadequate. But that's kind of a common theme in Scripture. There's a lot of other characters that kind of have this same response. Ultimately, they end up going a few rounds with God. Here's why you're wrong about me. Here's why I need to not do what you're asking me to do. As we look at Gideon, we're going to find out that he's a lot like us, because with Gideon, we kind of see that banter sometimes we're engaged in with God too. But God, why? But God, are you sure that's what you want? But why would you involve me in this? This is kind of crazy. I'm not able to do that. Ultimately, Gideon is a part of the cycle of the book of Judges. You may be familiar with the Old Testament book of Judges, where the people of Israel are given a new land of promise, and all they need to do is follow God's direction for life. But the book of Judges helps us to see they quickly forgot or ignored God, and it led to problems, which ends up causing them to call out to God and say, God, help us. So God helps, and things go well, and they end up going back to their old habits of forgetting about God or ignoring Him, and that leads to more problems. Now, this pattern all by itself could be its own life lesson for us, but Gideon is about to become the key leader to initiate some of these actions that God is looking to move in the life of the Israelites in order to help. Now, the problem this time is that the raiders are coming from the land of Midian nearby. They're stealing things. They're making people kind of own up as if the Midians are occupiers of them. And there's abuses and challenges and money and all kinds of different things that are being taken from the Israelites in a way that Israel was not really set up to live in the first place. And after they endured this for some time, they step into the pattern that we talked about a few moments ago, following it and crying out to God. And this is where we pick up the story in Judges chapter 6. An angel visits Gideon, and he says, here's what God has to say about what's been going on. God wants to do this, and He wants you to be a part of it, Gideon. And in Judges chapter 6, verses 11 and 12, this is what we hear Him say. Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, Mighty hero, the Lord is with you. Now Gideon is taken aback by this statement, and he's full of reasons why God's got it all wrong to involve him. He starts with a list of evidence that's stacked up against God. God, can you be trusted? There's this whole series of objections that are, but God, are you sure about this? And they begin in the next verse, verse 13. Sir, Gideon replied, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say, the Lord brought us up out of Egypt, but now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites? Well, he goes on to kind of quote information about his life that helps us to see he doesn't think he's all that valuable. And that's really based on his genealogy, which was important in Gideon's culture. His birth order, his heritage, who your family is, those were all important bits of connections. And so in Gideon's mind, those connections were equal to his potential in life. And so therefore, he was at the bottom rung. Check out verse 15. "But Lord," Gideon replied, "how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family." Well, he continues on kind of testing God, challenging him to prove that he is who he says he is. And he starts with an offering that's consumed by fire on a rock in verse 17. Gideon replied, "If you're truly going to help me, show me a sign to prove that it's really the Lord speaking to me. Don't go away until I come back and I bring my offering to you." Well, as if this test wasn't enough, he continues on with further tests later, and a statement you may have heard actually springs from this exchange between Gideon and God, a statement I've heard a number of times, which is to put out a fleece, meaning to check things out or to see what needs to happen next. Gideon does it 2 different times as we jump down to verses 36 through 40. Then Gideon said to God, "If you're truly going to use me to rescue Israel as you promised, prove it to me in this way. I'll put a wool fleece on the threshing floor tonight. If the fleece is wet, all with dew in the morning, but the ground is dry, then I will know that you're going to help me rescue Israel as you promised." And that's just what happened. When Gideon got up the next morning, he squeezed the fleece and wrung out a whole bowlful of water. Well, then Gideon said to God, "Please don't be angry with me. Let me make one more request. Let me use the fleece for just one more test. This time, let the fleece remain dry, while the ground all around it is wet with dew." So that night, God again did as Gideon had asked. The fleece was dry in the morning, but the ground was covered with dew. We don't know Gideon's true motives here, but it sure looks like he's trying to find every reason he can to wiggle out of this direction God is placing in his life. Gideon may even be in panic mode. He's looking at his ability to make things happen, and he's thinking about the implications of him getting involved in all of this. And it helps us to realize that Gideon didn't know what was about to happen, kind of the way we do if we've already read ahead a chapter or 2. But like us today, Gideon had created this narrative which can look like he was using some kind of a system of measuring things. Sometimes we use money and talent. Sometimes we use certain skills or opportunities in order to determine if we measure up to the blessing or the favor of God. Without the right things in a row, we believe that we may be just ordinary people who are part of the everybody else, unlike those who are truly prepared to be used by God. I love the simple story of a girl named Amy. Amy thought that in order to be important in life, she should have had blue eyes instead of the brown she was born with. Now, in her opinion, the modeling career she wanted was only within reach if she had had blue eyes. And I'm sure that there were a number of times in her young life where she asked God, "Why would you give me brown eyes instead of blue? You know what I want to do. You know that this is not possible without blue eyes." Later on, as an adult, Amy would travel to a foreign country, and her brown eyes actually allowed her to disguise herself in order to rescue children who were caught in circles of human trafficking. Her blue eyes actually would have betrayed her disguise. She would have been immediately recognized as a foreigner. Her disguise would have failed. Now, for Amy, For a period of time, she had been tethered to this chain of trading her perceived desirable physical traits as equal to her value in life. Now, what we find with Amy, and what we also find here with Gideon, is that our feelings of inadequacy can become God's opportunity. And although it appears as though Gideon may be trying to get out of what God is asking him to do through excuses and constant testing, in a very real way, the people who read this book first, the people who understood these stories in Gideon's time and day, might agree with Gideon more than God. Ultimately, they would understand that Gideon was not really any kind of a standout. He wasn't really the most logical pick for this mission. But even so, God understood that as Gideon was fearful, as he was reluctant, as Gideon's confidence was low, maybe even non-existent, Gideon was still God's pick for the job. So watch as we hear what God has to say to Gideon. We watch God's patience and his power at work. Check this out. Verse 12 we read earlier, but look at what he says to Gideon. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and says, "Mighty hero, the Lord is with you." And then we jump down to verse 14. The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you." In verse 16, the Lord said to him, "I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man." Now, we could say Gideon at this point is shackled to a simple stake in the ground. He's feeling the chafing of that chain and that shackle around his leg. God was inviting Gideon to take a step that would engage with him and step away from the shackles that he had been living in. And many of you know that Gideon did follow through and took a step in the direction that God wanted him to. And God showed his strength beyond anything Gideon could have possibly done. I mean, it's clear, absolutely nothing that happens next is as a result of Gideon's abilities or his attitude or any measure that people like us, either then or now, would so often use to determine the value of Gideon's life. God takes 32,000 volunteer soldiers of Israel down to a company of just 300. And their mission is now to attack hundreds of thousands of trained, battle-hardened warriors. That's nuts. There's a beekeeper in our congregation that knows all the right ways to open a hive. And one day when I was with him, we looked inside, and something he was familiar with that was absolutely mind-blowing for me was how absolutely alive the hive really was with activity. The combs were so full of motion with all of the insects in there, those bees just moving about. Maybe you've hit an anthill when you've been mowing the lawn, or something else has happened where you've come across a great number of insects in one small location. Well, that's what the scripture uses to describe the force that Gideon is going up against. It actually calls them, a whole group of locusts, a swarm, too many to count. And in this case, it's the valley that is crawling with so many soldiers, too many to count. And God's plan is to equip them for battle with a torch, a horn, and a clay pot. I mean, that's a completely crazy plan. No way this should ever work. But they win the day. And when we look back and see the amazing way that God operated, surpassing all military strategy and logic of any era of life, we realize that this account is not here to help us see what Gideon could do with some confidence boosters. If Gideon would just change his self-talk, that would make all the difference. That's not what this is about. This is really about what God would do to show his power and to demonstrate his patience. Because here's the deal. In spite of Gideon's objections, in spite of the hedging, the testing, in spite of the feelings of his own limitations, in a demonstration of God's patience, we also see God's power as God liberates the people of Israel from their oppressors, while at the same time he pursues and involves Gideon in the process. Author Philip Yancey said it this way: the Bible tells of flawed people just like me, who make shockingly bad choices and yet still find themselves pursued by God. But ultimately, it still had to come to a point where Gideon stopped arguing and started following. Now, the reason this is so cool, and you get this, is that this is not the story of Gideon. It's actually the story of God for people just like Gideon. If you've battled with doubt, if you've struggled with feeling vulnerable, if you've wondered what contribution you could ever make, if you've ever felt under-resourced, or if you've ever had a moment full of fear, if you've made excuses and tried to get out of God's direction, you know this is the way God operates. Many of us realize as we follow Jesus, he will extend us beyond our comfort zone and forces us to wrestle with the what is humanly possible versus the what is divinely probable. And in the process, he also unshackles us from our empty comparisons that have kept us confined in captivity. So the question for us as we consider the story of God as told about the man Gideon is this: what empty comparisons have kept us shackled from fully engaging with God? What empty comparisons have kept us shackled from fully engaging with God? While we're looking around for a set of skills that would qualify us for the work that God has, that he wants to do in us or through us, God is speaking value that calls us to take a step away from the shackles that have held us. We can find ourselves cowering under the pressure of comparison and end up pushing away and probably trying to test out a little bit like Gideon did. But in effect, what we do is we choose to agree then with our comparisons instead of the value that God has already spoken over us. On this account of Gideon, the big picture is that we see God at work in the wonder of his power and patience. And when Gideon stopped arguing and started following, he got to be part of it. Now maybe that describes some of your story too. Maybe it's time in some aspect of your life to stop arguing and start following. And it's not what we could accomplish as a result. It's how God could include us in what he's up to, and how we could be freed from our own shackles in the process. Imagine the story God is looking to write about what he could do to show his power or to demonstrate his patience with us. Because like Gideon, we are one of many examples of ordinary people in the hands of an extraordinary God.
Thanks again for joining us today. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channels, or if you're watching this on Facebook, then you can like and follow us there. And it would mean so much to us if you took a moment to comment, like, and share this video so that others are able to enjoy it as well. And hey, if you're in the Kingston area, come on out. We would love to see you. Please know though that you are loved and that we're praying for you. And we certainly appreciate your prayers too. We'll see you soon.